Hi, everyone. Right, so as it says over there, I'm Simon. I work at a company called NBIP. We're a not-for-profit. We're based in Netherlands. And I'm going to speak to you a little bit today about DDoS. And the reason I can do that is because that's what we do. We're a cloud scrubber. And in fact, some of our members are in the audience today, so they'll know what we do. When I got told that I was going to be presenting here at LINX, it's always quite exciting because LINX is a much more technical audience than some of the places I present. So when I was structuring this, I was trying to think of what I could give to the audience, a nice technical group of potential engineers or once were engineers. Obviously, I want to entertain you or at least keep your interest for the next 15 or so minutes. But also, I wanted to provide something that is maybe useful, pragmatic, that you could maybe take back to your networks. So I'm going to go through, obviously, because this is a anti-DDoS speech, I'm going to represent this a little bit later in signal to noise. It'll make a little bit more sense. But no DDoS presentation is worth its salt without first talking about the landscape trends and seeing what's out there. Now, obviously, it's quite a big topic, DDoS. I could have picked quite a few trends to follow. What I find is quite interesting, what we keep an eye out for or on, is the layer 7 to layer 3 and 4 distribution in the attack landscape. So over the past sort of 10 to 15 years, there's been a marketable acceleration in layer 7 attacks. That has been pretty consistent. It's driven a lot of investment into layer 7 protection and so on. What we saw in the last couple of years is that sort of plateau a little bit, and we were getting to more of a 50-50 split, as you can see here from the 2023-24 stats. But as of fairly recently, we've seen a bit of shift on that. So you can see there's actually a marketable notable comeback from layer 3 and layer 4 attacks. They're a little bit dumber in the sense that sometimes it's a lot easier to get the signature and to apply a decent mitigation. But it's like bell bottoms. It's back in fashion. So this is a very interesting metric that I like to show. It really emphasizes the data that drives my narrative. But actually, I can break this down to you in a more honest way, which is including the data points to the most recent one. It's not as dramatic as the previous slide, but it still drives the same point. Layer 3 and 4 is for the last year anyway been quite prevalent. And you can see this from different producers of metrics, by the way. So feel free to go online and pick a vendor. So let's talk a little bit about scary metrics. Again, it wouldn't be worth my salt if I was presenting and not scaring someone. I assume that there's some risk officers in the room, which is fantastic, because these are the metrics that drive boardroom conversations. They drive budget allocation. And if the engineers in the room, it's the conversations about these scary metrics that get you your new toys that you can play with. So this is it. I don't actually I see metrics presented like this quite often. I don't really like this particular type of presenting metrics because it looks like all the various vectors here, and specifically they're talking about packets per second and bits per second, which is indicative of a layer 3 and 4 attack, and then requests per second, which is sort of a layer 7 HTTPS. Now it looks like there's a sort of a relationship in the scaling, but it's not so. If you look at the same actual data points that they've put on here, the rise of, right in the beginning, just before 2010, you're talking about 600,000 packets per second being the maximum request per second, and that's now 46 million requests per second. So there's been a drastic increase in the layer 7 metrics, but that is, like I said, that was a lot of catch-up. So if you take the same data and you just graph it differently, you can actually see the different impact over the last 10 years. So you'll see here that the request per second had a much higher accelerated growth over this period. But I'm just going to ignore that for a second because packets per second and bits per second are also, during that same period, have also accelerated, just not nearly as much. So you look at the packets per second increase of about a factor of 18, and then obviously by 36 for gigabits per second. So it's just overflowing bandwidth, basically. Now, the way that I look at this is to a signal-to-noise ratio. Like I said, these are the big events. These are the ones that land up in the newspapers. These are the ones that land up in the conversation in the in the boardrooms. And this is very important, like this, understanding these attacks and understanding what you can do to protect your infrastructure from these attacks is very critical. But actually, I think this tells half of the story. I mean, this is essentially a representation of our dashboard. As a DDoS scrubber, I mean, our dashboard is basically a show of the actual attacks that are coming in on a daily basis for our member base. Now, I was told I wasn't allowed to use a screenshot from our actual dashboard for this event, so this is not an actual legitimate output, but it very much looks like this on a daily, weekly basis, where there's a lot of noise representing small attacks, and then with regular cadence, there are these larger events that are network busters, if you want to call them, something like that. Okay, so that's interesting. You'll hear a lot about that a lot about these signal events in all the different presentations that you go to about DDoS. But I think what's also interesting is to actually, especially now because there's actual engineers in the audience, to actually talk about what an average DDoS looks like. It's a little bit underwhelming, actually. Everything that I've shown you prior to this indicates that the DDoS space is getting bigger, more dangerous, more impactful, etc., and it is. But that doesn't actually tell you what an average DDoS attack looks like. By far, numerically, the average DDoS we have doesn't come close to that type of impact. In fact, when we look at the data that we have for 2025, for the whole year, this is the size of your average DDoS. Very underwhelming, right? I know I'm supposed to be coming up here driving fear, driving investment, and so on. But actually, one would argue that less than 500 megabits per second can be absorbed, probably without even triggering a DDoS response. Also, useful information is that most of these attacks are actually under 10 minutes. We try to look into this as to why this is. There is sort of a consensus in the industry that these are reconnaissance attacks, and there actually is some, let's say, circumstantial evidence that points to that. So we see the same IP space, so presumably this means the same bots that are included in these small attacks as we do in these large, like I said, infrastructure buster events. So if I had to break down to you, if you had to ask me, should I say, what is the attack that I'm most likely to get, right? This is what it's going to look like. 8 out of 10 attacks will include multi-vector. This means that at least 2 different policies are impacting on that. 7.5 out of these attacks will be UDP-based. And what I mean by UDP-based is that the largest vector in that attack will be a UDP-based vector. I thought maybe it's worth mentioning that we're talking about bell bottoms and making comebacks. DNS amplification, which has always kind of been in the top 15 for sure. For the last couple of years, it's been hanging around sort of 8, 9, or 10 on our top 10 metrics. But over the last year, it's right there, number 1, and there's a substantial difference between number 1 and number 2. So it's back, it's doing its thing. I wouldn't drive much policy on this because next year we'll probably get something completely different at the top of the metrics. But what's really interesting here is what I was mentioning now before with those pie charts, is that your average attack is really, really small. It's less than 500 megabits per second, less than 100,000 packets per second, and it will last for less than 10 minutes. Now, arguably this wouldn't even trigger a DDoS response on your side. So if you ask me what the average attack is, that's what it is, not very impactful. There's no point in us having a business. We can all go home, you're all safe. It's not the case because the extra 1.5 attacks that you're going to get out of 10, you're going to know about. So what can you do? Like, how can you protect yourself better? As I was mentioning, I got told that I was going to speak here, and I was chatting to Holly. She did mention that as a technical audience, the more technical the discussion, the better. In fact, the more industry acronyms you can throw in, the better, all right? So I'm going to kick off with, I'd like to say it's an industry acronym. It's totally not. I made it up for this presentation. But it does drive what I think is a really good way to think about DDoS, right? Proper preparation prevents prolonged pain. And I think the biggest P that you need to take note there is prolonged. Sometimes mitigation, there's no other way to do this, it's reactive. There's going to be impact until somebody steps in, analyzes the attack data, applies a policy, and so on, and you can move forward. But realistically, and you should plan like this, it's often actually not preventable. If you're looking at that scary metric graph I showed earlier, I think the bits per second was up at around 4 terabits as the highest one seen sort of just above the 2020 mark. I mean, that's going to break networks. That's going to break applications. That's going to break a lot of things, 4 terabits. So, plan around that. Plan to, there's a lot that I could go into in planning and stuff. I only have probably about 7 minutes left, so I'm not going to do that now. Myself and my colleague Frank will be out there if you want to discuss any of these topics in a little bit more detail. But you should be considering moving forward with a, how would I say, reduction in performance. So a performance reduction, that could be something like a latency on an application. You might get, if you look at your support structure, you might see a little increase of complaints or massive increase on complaints from customers. But if the application is up, that could be considered a win, depending on the attack at the moment. Reduced accessibility definitely should be considered. One of the very, geo policies are a beautiful thing, but also if you don't know how to use them properly, it can be very painful. An example I'll show you a bit later. But certainly if your application is down right away and most of your client base is on the island, a geo policy to restrict traffic just to the island can bring your application up for the majority of your customers and essentially buy you time to then do a much more intelligent, well thought out mitigation later on to bring the application up for everyone. And then of course additional costing. This is actually an interesting one. A lot of DDoS is sold sort of like an insurance policy. So there's a type of insurance level that you can take. It definitely follows the law of diminishing returns. So if you're spending $50,000 a month on DDoS protection, $60,000 a month doesn't buy you 10,000 extra worth of protection. So at some point, realistically, there's going to be a line in the sand where there's a budget constraint and you can build your protections to that point. But something that people forget is while it costs you money to protect against DDoS events, it's actually costing perpetrators money to generate a DDoS attack against you. DDoS attacks always end, always. Right, so if I had to give you some real practical advice about how you can prepare for these attacks, it's pretty straightforward. I mean, you don't have to think too much out the box here, but actually these are really important. The questions that we always ask first during an event are not technical. They are about the application, about the IP, logical questions. Who's the customer base? Is this application that's under attack, is it the back end for a cell phone app? Well, I mean, that's a pretty non-technical question, but actually on the back of that answer, you could block all ranges from hosted facilities based on the fact that your client shouldn't be there. So logical questions, logical thinking can lead to very impactful mitigations on the technical side. You don't have to dive into what, packet analysis right away. Knowing your peacetime profile is really, really useful. When we get into these events and we talk, if you're able to answer questions about packet sizes, packet distributions between different protocols, etc., it's very easy for us then to immediately see an abnormality. And then, of course, know your application IP space. This is probably the biggest thing that you can maybe take home today is know if you've got IP space allocated to, say, your network infrastructure, we can quite easily black hole those IPs under an event. So you can get a really rapid turnaround on a response. It's a dumb response, a black hole, but if you know it's a router's IP and nobody's going to be sending traffic to that router, it's an effective one and it's a quick one. And both of those your boss will worry about. Okay, so I'm going to give you some examples of some experiences that we've had that I've classified into bad, good, and great. And maybe this will help you start thinking about the scenarios that you might be ended up in. So this is my example of the worst request from a customer. In his defense, I will say he was new to the position of network manager and didn't have a good understanding of everything and requested us to add a geo block on to a /23. That geo block was because their customer base was solely from their one country and we could lock it down. We obviously suggested that was not a particularly good plan. And on the back of that, we deployed it because it was requested, but we sat there waiting for the call to rollback, which came about 5 minutes later. Lots of things broke, authentication broke, all sorts of things broke that you just don't know, really. Geopolicies are a bit like that, a big blunt hammer. Right, so this guy, where I think he failed was, well, not failed, he just didn't have the information around. He didn't know what cloud services were being used. A lot of cloud services means you will speak to regions like the US without even knowing about it. You know, obviously, we hadn't even looked at the attack data yet. If it was all being proxied through that same region that he wanted to geo-block, it wouldn't have made much of a difference anyway. But most notably, the outbound requests. This always pops up on our side because a lot of the attack vectors are actually response packet types. So if you know that this IP doesn't initiate any connections to the internet, it's a very simple flip for us. You might even see a theme here, like the actual triggers that we can flip on and off right away are quite simple, actually. And if you know the right answers to these questions up front, we can save the application while then we do a deeper, further analysis into actual vectors and custom, deploy custom filters and so on. So about these IP requests, I'm going to give you an example now, right? It's pretty straightforward. A SYN gets sent out from the target. We're expecting a SYN ACK back. What's important, okay, this architecture is the architecture for like a cloud scrubber. The bubble in the middle is the internet, but actually a lot of anti-DDoS solutions, even within a network, will have an asymmetric path where inbound routing will route through the scrubbers, but actually outbound communication will go direct. So in a scenario like this, this is a legitimate good SYN ACK response. But what you'll notice here is the DDoS application did not see the actual SYN going out. So you can't sort of rely on the same connection tracking mechanisms as firewalls or other security products. Obviously, in an attack scenario, you can either just spoof SYN ACKs because there's not much work in that. But if you also, this represents a reflection attack. Now you've got bad SYN ACKs going through the same path. Now there's a lot. It's a lot more to ask the devices to now determine which is a good SYN ACK, which is a bad SYN ACK. There's not much in that packet actually to tell. So there's a false positive or false negative ratio that's included in that. So best if you say we don't expect traffic or we don't expect connections to be sourced from this IP, we can already toggle on 30 different, toggle off 30 different attack vectors just by flipping a switch. Very useful information to have. Right, then we had an incident last year where one of our members, and in this case it was a VoIP provider, it was such a pleasure dealing with them. The whole, from start of attack to full mitigation was really, really quick. It was a complex attack, and the reason why this was is because we got to speak to the right people in the right call immediately. They had a response team, so they knew in a DDoS event, we want these guys to be in the call. They set that up within 10 minutes. We were in a call with these engineers. They could tell us stuff like the packet sizes that they expect based on the codecs that they used, which is fantastic. Immediately then you can siphon off any packets that don't meet that size criteria. Same with fragmented sizes. They could give us that information, give us the endpoint IPs, and they could give us instant feedback on the policy deployment, which is actually super useful if you're toggling something on and off. So if you make a mistake, you can roll back pretty quickly. Okay, one of the really cool things that we implemented here, which I'm going to talk about now, which I think is a really, really underused strategy, is called byte matching. Probably some of you already know about byte matching. Probably even less of you are implementing it in your networks. Now, the reason why this is so good, specifically for UDP packets, which are traditionally a little bit harder to tell if it's legit than a TCP packet, is because you probably already support this feature already. Byte matching can be done at the router layer. I'm pretty sure SROS, so Nokia routers support this. Definitely Juniper routers support this. So you can deploy that on the routers you probably already have deployed at the moment. Another really useful fact about this is it's not one specific protocol. Sorry, I meant to flip that over so you can see what I'm talking about. This example is SIP. It's got a well-defined RFC or rather the RFC defines the packet structure very well. So you can absolutely do this with SIP. There's only certain features that are going to be I think you need to announce the packet type, and that's typically done within the first 8 to 10 bytes of the packet. So we can look at characteristics of the headers, and it can all say SIP. And then we can look at those first 8 bytes, and it's not a register, publish, refer, or any of the things that we expect to see from the RFC, and we can drop that packet, which is super useful because most of the attack loads are dummy payloads on headers that look legit. Now, this is a fantastic, fantastic protection, and if you do use any things, you should, any UDP applications or host any applications, you should look into this. You can also do this on IP tables, so you can deploy it at various places. And this, like I said, is a really good protection, but this is actually not the best protection we've seen for UDP packets. There was another member that we dealt with a little while ago. They owned the application itself. You can think of like an Android app or something. If you own the application itself, then you can actually do some really cool and interesting things there to protect your application. So they were using the same concept, the same methodology, byte matching. But in this case, what they did was they injected custom bytes into the payloads. Now, the way that they did it, which I thought was very insightful, is they had a pool. I don't know exactly how much it was. Call it 30 different byte strings that they would rotate every month. Whenever there was an attack, typically some user would have a look at the packets, see a particular byte string if they were actually putting in the effort, and then mimic that out through the bot. Which means at any single point they could turn off that byte, block that byte. They would be at a reduced capacity. 1 in 30 of their members would immediately be cut off, or of their users. But at the same time, it's something instant. They had that in a workflow, and it was ready to go. And this is really, really useful. You can, like us, it's basically the same presentation, except it's custom bytes that you can inject, rotate, and build all your policies in advance of. So that's super useful. If you can do that, you should look into it. And then I want to finish off with this a general idea. Obviously, I could dive into any of these topics in greater detail. But one thing that also is often lacking when we have to get called into a war room is that there is no break glass in case of emergency process or DDoS workbook. Sometimes we see really, really good workbooks. They've got different pre-approved actions for different types of impact. So a network engineer working a night shift doesn't need to wake his boss up to see if he can black hole a particular IP. If that IP comes from this pool, and et cetera, and it follows it down, they can just pull the trigger themselves. Greatly accelerates a whole bunch of things. DNS flexibility, if you own your own name servers, obviously your DNS guys are probably saying, let's have a TTL of 48 hours or something. It just makes things a lot more efficient on the DNS platform. But actually, if you want to use, I want to be a bit flexible with DNS, which is still a really good feature. Obviously, some attacks will be using DNS, so it'll just follow you as you move the A record, for instance. But that's not always the case. So this is actually a very useful mechanism. Again, this is something that you need to plan in advance and implement as a strategy. The last resort workflow can be as easy as understanding which are the most important components of your offerings, which services are the money spinners, which are not. Have a hierarchy of switches that can be turned off. Everything can be done. You can turn off an attack on an application and ruin some people's days for the sole purpose of keeping another application available to a completely different customer base. That's a management decision. Your network engineer is not going to be making those. So if you can make those in advance, or at least have the structure for those decisions to be made in advance, that's super useful. And then obviously pre-documented policies or deployed, semi-deployed policies, they might exist on the router or on the anti-DDoS device or on wherever it is, and just be sitting there with the action being just to deploy or move it from a disabled to an active state, something that can be done really, really quickly. And the last thing I just want to say, or second last thing, is about defining the win. During attacks, if it's a small attack, it's probably not a problem. You can look to get back to 100%. During a really big attack, sometimes you're going to have to think about cutting the arm off to save the body. It's not a nice way to think about it, but if you keep that in mind, you can get back to a point where you are still servicing a large portion of your member base. And my last point, going back to Ingrid's opener this morning, is come on, Bafana. Oh, see that tonight. Can I